November 28, 1942. The temperature on the southern steppe had dropped to minus 34 degrees Celsius. A Soviet commissar stood in a frozen trench near the Don River, holding a piece of paper that could have him shot by his own side. The order in his hand was clear. The order in his conscience was clearer. Within 72 hours, his decision to ignore Stalin's most notorious command would rescue 500 men from encirclement and cost him nearly everything. To understand what that commissar risked, you need to understand Order Number 227. In the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front was unraveling at a pace that terrified Moscow. German Army Group South had torn through Soviet defenses like paper, advancing over 600 kilometers in 6 weeks. Entire Soviet armies, not divisions, not regiments, entire armies, had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The city of Rostov-on-Don fell on July 24th. The road to Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields lay essentially open. Joseph Stalin, a man who had survived political purges, collectivization crises, and the catastrophic opening months of Operation Barbarossa, was shaken in a way that few around him had ever witnessed. On July 28, 1942, he issued what became one of the most brutal orders in the history of modern warfare. Order 227, known in the Red Army by the phrase every Soviet soldier came to know by heart, Nishadu Nazad, not one step back. The order did not mince words. It declared the commanders who permitted unauthorized retreat would be treated as traitors to the motherland. It established Strafroty, punishment battalions, where officers stripped of rank would be sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front to, in Stalin's own words, wash away their shame with their blood. Blocking detachments. Armed units positioned directly behind Soviet front lines received orders to shoot retreating soldiers on sight. Not capture them, not arrest them for tribunal, shoot them. The NKVD documented that between the order's issuance in July 1942 and the end of the war, over 158,000 Soviet soldiers were executed under its provisions. An additional 422,700 were sent to punishment battalions, where survival rates in some operations barely reached 25%. The order was simultaneously an act of desperation and a calculated psychological weapon. Stalin understood something that Western military analysts would debate for decades afterward. The Soviet soldier of 1942 was not retreating because he lacked courage. He was retreating because his command structure had collapsed, his supply lines had been severed, and he had watched his comrades die in operations that seemed to have no coherent objective. Order 227 was designed not merely to stop retreat, but to redirect the psychological machinery of fear. If the alternative to standing and dying was being shot by your own blocking detachment, the math of survival changed brutally in favor of holding ground. But here is what the order could never account for: the difference between strategic retreat and tactical withdrawal, between cowardice and calculated survival, between following a command issued from a Moscow office and making a decision in a frozen trench with 500 lives in the balance and German armor closing from 3 directions. The Commissar at the center of this story was a political officer, a role that most Western accounts reduced to either villain or cipher. The Commissar system had its own brutal history. After the purges of 1937-1938, which had gutted the Red Army's officer corps of approximately 35,000 experienced commanders, political officers were reinstated with dual command authority. They were there to monitor ideological loyalty, to counter what the party considered defeatism, and in early 1941, many of them had been catastrophically unqualified for the military situations they suddenly found themselves navigating. German forces had been specifically ordered to execute commissars upon capture. The infamous Commissar Order of June 6, 1941, which meant Soviet political officers fought with the knowledge that surrender was not a survivable option. By late 1942, the Commissar system had evolved. After the disasters of the opening year, practical battlefield authority had been largely restored to line commanders. The dual command structure had been officially abolished in October 1942 by Order 307, just weeks before the events near the Don. But in practice, in the field, in units that hadn't fully absorbed the new directive, commissars still carried enormous weight. Their written reports could condemn a commander. Their approval or their silence could mean the difference between a decoration and a tribunal. The commissar in question, and the historical record here draws primarily from Soviet archival material declassified in the 90s and the memoirs of surviving veterans of the 63rd Army, was attached to a rifle regiment that had been part of the Soviet counteroffensive architecture surrounding Stalingrad, what would become Operation Uranus. But this regiment was not in the main thrust of Uranus. It was positioned along the Don River bend, part of the northern shoulder of what Soviet planners intended as a containment line. When the German counterattack in this sector came, it came faster than the regiment's command had anticipated. And it came with Panzer Grenadier support, motorized infantry backed by Panzer IVs, and at least one company of Stooge 3 assault guns, the short-barreled variant that by late 1942 was being progressively replaced by the long 75mm gun version, capable of defeating T-34 frontal armor at combat ranges. The regiment's commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel whose name appears in archival records, assessed the situation by 030 hours on the 28th with the kind of brutal clarity that 3 weeks of continuous combat instills in a man. The regiment's right flank had ceased to exist. Communication with division headquarters had been severed for 11 hours. The remaining 500 men, survivors of a unit that had entered the lines 6 weeks earlier with over 1,100, were occupying a position that would become a killing ground within 4 hours of daylight. The math was simple. Withdraw to the tree line 3 kilometers northeast, and there was a defensible ridge line, a possible link-up with elements of the 21st Army, and a fighting chance. Stay, and 500 men would die or be captured, their graves marking the exact coordinates of Soviet failure. The lieutenant colonel wrote the withdrawal order. Then he looked at the Commissar. What happened next is documented in 2 separate post-war accounts. One from a surviving sergeant who was present, another from a junior political officer who served in the same unit. The Commissar did not immediately sign the order. He asked 3 questions. How many men could realistically be moved before dawn? Could the regiment's 2 remaining 45mm anti-tank guns be withdrawn without losing them? And what was the last confirmed position of any friendly unit within radio range? These were not ideological questions. They were the questions of a man trying to construct a withdrawal that looked, on paper, like something other than what Order 227 explicitly prohibited. The lieutenant colonel answered all 3. The Commissar countersigned the withdrawal order at 0347 hours, added a notation describing the movement as a tactical redeployment in response to encirclement conditions, and then did something that would define the rest of the story. He kept a copy. He filed it in his own records, separate from the regimental documents that would travel with the unit. The withdrawal began at 0415. 512 men moved through -34-degree darkness across terrain that had been churned by shell fire and then frozen solid into a landscape of irregular, ankle-breaking furrows. The 245mm guns were manhandled across 800 meters of open ground by 6-man crews who wrapped their hands in spare cloth because regulation winter gloves had run out 3 weeks earlier. The Mosin Nagant rifles the men carried, the M91/30 variant, 1.23 meters long, bolt-action, firing the 7.6254mm R cartridge that Soviet soldiers had been using since the reign of the Tsar, had to be kept inside coats between firing positions because the lubricating oil in the actions congealed below -25 degrees Celsius, turning bolts into frozen levers that required 2 hands to operate. Several men abandoned weapons rather than carry the weight. The Commissar made a specific note of who abandoned what. He did not have them shot. At 0612, the lead elements of the regiment reached the ridgeline. At 0714, the first German reconnaissance aircraft made a pass over the positions they had vacated at 0415. At 0840, German artillery began a sustained bombardment of those same empty positions. A bombardment that lasted 40 minutes and fired approximately 1,400 shells into ground that held not one Soviet soldier. But the incident did not end with a successful withdrawal. It entered a far more dangerous phase. Division headquarters re-established communication at approximately 0930 hours on November 28. The first message from the divisional operations officer was not a status inquiry. It was a notification that a blocking detachment, an NKVD-controlled unit of approximately 60 men, was being dispatched to investigate reports of unauthorized movement by the regiment. Under the provisions of Order 227, the investigation itself carried mortal risk. A tribunal could convene within hours. The lieutenant colonel and the commissar both knew that the documentation they had created, the tactical redeployment notation, the timestamps, the pre-dawn communication blackout, might or might not satisfy a military court. operating under wartime pressure. What the divisional operations officer did not know, because the regiment had been cut off when it happened, was that at 10:15 hours, elements of the 21st Army had made contact with the regiment's forward scouts on the ridgeline. Exactly as the lieutenant colonel had projected, the link-up had not just saved 500 men, it had inadvertently extended the 21st Army's flank by 3 kilometers in a sector where a gap had been threatening to open since the previous evening. The regimental position on the ridgeline was, by the objective measure of tactical geometry, more valuable to Soviet operational planning than the riverside trench the regiment had abandoned to German artillery. The blocking detachment arrived at the regiment's new position at approximately 1400 hours. The Commissar met them before they reached the lieutenant colonel. Veterans' accounts describe what followed as something between an interrogation and a negotiation. The Commissar presented his documentation, the signed withdrawal order, the timestamps, the notation about encirclement conditions, and critically, a written confirmation from the 21st Army liaison officer that the regimental position on the ridgeline had been formally incorporated into the Army's defensive line. He did not argue that Order 227 was wrong. He argued, with the precision of a man who had spent months learning to speak the language of Soviet military bureaucracy, that the order had been followed in spirit because the regiment had not retreated from the enemy. It had maneuvered into a position from which it could continue to engage the enemy. The distinction was, in the strictest interpretation of Order 227's language, defensible. The blocking detachment commander, a major of the NKVD border troops, held the regiment under effective detention for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, the temperature dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. 17 men required treatment for frostbite incurred during the overnight withdrawal. 1 man lost 2 fingers. The Commissar's own hands, the sergeant's post-war account notes, showed the white patches of frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand, the hand he had used to write and countersign the original withdrawal order. The major ultimately filed a report describing the movement as operationally justified. Whether he was persuaded by the documentation or by the presence of the 21st Army liaison officer, whose institutional authority was considerably larger than a regimental commissar's, is not entirely clear from the archival record. What is clear is that no tribunal was convened. The lieutenant colonel retained his command. The commissar retained his position. 512 men were alive on November 29th, who would not have been alive had the regiment remained in its original position. The long-term accounting is worth dwelling on. Of those 512 men, the regiment fought continuously through the completion of Operation Uranus, through the defeat of Operation Winter Storm, the German attempt to relieve the 6th Army encircled at Stalingrad, and into the early months of 1943. The 21st Army, to whose flank the regiment had contributed, participated in the final reduction of Stalingrad's Kessel, when Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of the German 6th Army on February 2, 1943, approximately 91,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Of that number, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The strategic weight of Stalingrad, the turning point the most serious historians of the Eastern Front mark as the moment the war's outcome became measurably determined, rested on 1,000 decisions exactly like the one made in that trench in the early hours of November 28th. Order 227 itself remained in force, technically, until May 1945, but its practical application shifted dramatically after Stalingrad. The blocking detachments were officially disbanded in October 1944, though individual instances of their use persisted. The punishment battalions continued to function throughout the war. What changed was the culture of enforcement, the degree to which experienced commanders at all levels found ways to exercise tactical judgment within a framework that theoretically permitted none. The Soviet military did not suddenly become less authoritarian after Stalingrad. It became, in practice, more sophisticated about the gap between written orders and operational reality. The Commissar in this account was awarded the Order of the Red Star in early 1943, a decoration that, in Soviet military culture, meant something specific. It was not the grand decoration of the Order of the Red Banner or the Gold Star of a hero of the Soviet Union. It was the decoration of a man who had done something that mattered in a way that someone in authority had decided to acknowledge without making too much noise about. He survived the war. He returned to civilian life in 1946. He left no published memoir. His name appears in archival records, in a sergeant's post-war testimony, and in the footnotes of a 1987 Soviet military history of the Don Front operations, a work that was itself a product of a historiographical culture that had not yet fully reckoned with what Order 227 had actually meant for the men who lived and died under it. The true ledger of Order 227 is still being written. Post-Soviet archival access has progressively complicated the narrative that Soviet historians were permitted to construct during the Cold War. The order stopped retreats. It also killed men who could have lived. It produced the Stalingrad defense. It also produced blocking detachment massacres that the Red Army buried in classified files for 50 years. It was a weapon of desperation wielded by a regime that had already killed millions of its own citizens, used now as an instrument of military survival. Understanding it honestly requires holding both truths simultaneously, the terror and the effectiveness, the dead and the saved, without resolving the contradiction into a clean moral verdict that the history simply does not support. 500 men walked to a ridgeline in the dark at -34°C because one political officer decided that saving them mattered more than the piece of paper that said otherwise. That decision does not redeem the system that produced Order 227, but it tells you something precise and specific about what men do at the edge of survival, when doctrine ends and judgment begins, and the only record that will ever fully exist is the one they keep themselves. If that story of one man's impossible decision on the frozen Don steppe held you to the end, wait until you see what happened 900 kilometers northwest, where 25 Red Army soldiers held a single grain warehouse in Stalingrad, against repeated assault by an entire German infantry battalion for 11 days straight, with nothing but Mosin rifles, 3 PPSH, 1 submachine guns, and the rubble of a building that refused to fall. That story goes live this Thursday. Subscribe to WW2 Storyverse right now because the Eastern Front's most defining moments are still being told, and you will not want to miss what's coming next.